The Negro still is not free. The life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. The Negro still is not free. The Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. The Negro still is not free. The Negro is still languished in the corners of American society and finds himself in exile in his own land. The Negro still is not free. America has given the Negro people a bad check, a check which has come back marked insufficient funds. The Negro still is not free. The Negro still is not free. The Negro still is not free. Those who hope that the Negro needed to blow off steam and will now be content will have a rude awakening if the nation returns to business as usual.
To watch all of my exclusive content not featured here on my channel, log on to my website at imjustheretomakeyoutthink.com/films. OCO, my brothers and sisters, relatives, free thinkers, and spiritual warriors. Today, let's begin this segment with asking some very essential questions pertaining to this topic at hand. First, did the origins of the said last names, or rather surnames, of so-called slaves in America derive from some form of European ancestry? And if you answered yes, then what hard evidence exists today that not only supports this heavily campaigned theory, but can also confirm that it is in fact the truth indefinitely? Now, I understand that some of you would normally consider traditional information given to you to be a fact, without noticing that you just inadvertently allowed someone's opinion to be considered valuable as a source of creditable information, in your opinion. However, a person's opinion does not mean, nor should it be automatically constituted as the truth, especially when it lacks publicly verifiable evidence to prove it. I mean, think about it. Could it be possible that certain pieces of verifiable evidence that many people are looking for today, much of it has been rewritten, altered, photoshopped, hidden, or even altogether misconstrued? Like, for example, things that were said to have been done on a particular date have been changed to reflect as other dates, allegedly due to the insertion of the Gregorian calendar. I mean, even words that you may recall its meaning today have literally changed in definition and in spelling several times over, along with the names of particular people and said locations. And even what was originally deemed as a prediction is now somehow considered a historical fact by various so-called professionals. So, finding the truth would be very complex, especially when an individual limits themselves to thinking inside of the box versus allowing themselves to experience a physical freedom in which you would not need to be deceased in order to qualify to reap its many benevolent benefits. As Western European entities established what we know now as American history, they also created a tale informing us as Americans that the use of last names, or rather surnames, derived from, quote, the need to find ways to differentiate between two people who shared the same first name, end quote. Which seems harmless at first and quite obvious, of course, if you're not conducting an investigation into the reason why the National Endowment for the Humanities, established on September 29, 1965, goes on to state, quote, because the British were among the first Europeans to settle in North America, many modern American surnames can be traced back to medieval England, Scotland, Ireland, and Wales, end quote. Now, this statement forces the reader to believe that since foreigners of European descent immigrated to North America some 240 years ago, that they somehow influenced millions of people already residing in North America prior to their arrival to take on European surnames over the years, without telling you exactly how it was pulled off. Which should make you ask the question, if the so-called Negro slaves of America, who were realistically undervalued agricultural employees, were treated as less of a human being and more like human cargo for sale, then what would make the said owner or employer want to attach their so-called European surname to that individual when it was not federally mandated to do so? Now, there are theories floating around stating that the slave masters marked their human properties by using their surname upon them. However, if that was actually true, then the surname Underwood, for example, would somehow have a European background, right? But the truth is, it does not. And that also means that every surname in America does not have a European background. But let's go a little bit deeper now, shall we? According to the National Endowment for Humanities Society, quote, during the Middle Ages, the feudal system meant that most people in Europe lived in small farming villages. As the population expanded and the towns grew, however, a need arose to find ways to differentiate between two people who shared the same first name, end quote. Now, I can agree with this statement, and I can also add that the so-called feudal system realistically occurred everywhere human life existed. I mean, everyone's population grew, right? So you can't tell me that since Europe's population grew, that they somehow were the first to create surnames without confirming evidence that surnames or the use of surnames never existed anywhere else before. That's just critical thinking. Now, throughout my years of investigative research, I noticed a common pattern that authors of American history loves to use. There are tons of storytelling in American history, but with very little evidence to support and prove that the said stories are in fact true in most cases. So, when was the first last name or surname ever used in history? Now, the answer to this question is so complex that there is no definitive answer. However, some of you who agrees with sociology with an added mixture of mythology would immediately give the credit of surnames to the Chinese, strictly based on yet another story. As the myth, legend, or folktale goes, the Chinese have been using surnames since 2800 BC by way of royal order from the reigning Chinese emperor of their time named Fuxi. It was said that Fuxi created and mandated a naming system in order to control census taking and census information. But since this story, along with the Emperor Fuxi story, is a myth, there is no hard evidence to support this claim or theory in this sense. The reason why it is so complex to track down and determine beyond a reasonable doubt where these last names, family names, or surnames originated from is because of the various types of surnames used all across the world, it would strictly depend on the individual and where they come from, due to multiple practices of the use of surnames varies from culture to culture. This means that it will be impossible to determine that you bear a quote European surname, because the practice of having a first name and a middle name and a last name as a mandatory rule realistically has no significant evidence to support where and when exactly it originated. Even the Indians of all of the Americas, for example, bear 2 to 5 names as an individual's full name without orchestrating it in a commonly known first name, middle name, and last name format, or so we think. Mind you, there are 4 common categories of surnames that were used throughout the history of North America and many other parts of the world as well. There are locative surnames, patronymic surnames, occupational surnames, and nickname surnames. To break each of them down, a locative surname identifies an individual based upon where he or she was born, raised, lived, worked, or the land they own, which makes this surname not qualified for consideration of being of European origin. For example, Charles Darwin was probably a descendant of a family that previously lived in the market town called Darwin, which is located in Lancashire, England. Or let's take the actor Lawrence Fishburne, for example, in which the surname Fishburne could indicate that Lawrence's ancestors worked as cooks that specializes in seafood cuisine, or just simply frying fish. Another example of a locative surname could also be referring to a particular geographical identifier, in which most cases is self-explanatory, like for example, the actor Blair Underwood, in which the surname Underwood could be an indicator that refers to a family who resides near or throughout the woods. Or it could also mean that his ancestors owned acres of lands, particularly within the woods. No European origin yet. Now, a patronymic surname identifies an individual as their father's child or their father's children. However, it is very important to note that this surname does not translate to a fixed family surname, in which this also means that it does not qualify to be considered as a surname of any European origin. Like for example, take pro NFL running back Adrian Peterson. The surname Peterson could indicate that Adrian is the son of Peter, which would equate to being Adrian, Peter's son. Or in some cases it will read as Peter's son Adrian, or in modern times, Adrian Peterson, by dropping one letter S. Other examples of patronymic surnames would be Jackson, Williamson, Richardson, Robinson, Wilson, Jefferson, Johnson, Woodson, or any other said surname ending with the suffix son. Now, in most cases, you would discover that the vowels of the said letters would change as well, like the surname Steelman would later be spelled as Steelman, with 2-letter E's in the word steel, and the letter A replaces the letter E in the word man, but it keeps its original pronunciation. Still not finding any European origin yet. So now, occupational or status surnames identifies an individual based upon their social status or their occupations. Some of you can recall noticing many occupational surnames throughout multiple different languages, almost as if it was a common practice for many countries across the world over the years. This also means that these types of surnames do not originate from just one large landmass to another. However, it does indicate that some cultures of particular countries shared some similarities, but that does not mean that one copied the other or one started that tradition before the other. No. Haven't you ever heard the saying, great minds think alike? Now, don't get me wrong here. There are tons of traditional methods of particular people's cultures, languages, identities, and more that were either copied, adopted, erased, or even stolen for that matter, but that's not the point here. The point is, when you are researching your family's genealogy by records, that does in fact exist. In most cases, you will discover that you do not have any form of European ancestry, as long as you are referring to actual physical historical genealogy records of your family and not some mysterious genealogy DNA ancestry test that disclaims that it is just for entertainment purposes only. Let's take the name James Farmer, for example, as an occupational surname. This would indicate that he is the James of the farmers, or he could just simply be a farmer named James. Other examples would be Smith, Butler, Wheeler, Booker, Turner, Cooker, Taylor, or Baker, just to name a few. And logically speaking, you cannot determine that their origins are from some random place in Europe without first determining what common language was used in order for foreigners to communicate with our ancestors here in the Americas upon their arrival. Which should make you ask the question, was there ever a common language to begin with? How did foreigners communicate with other foreigners without a translator? How did ship owners in America allegedly sail all the way to West Africa in hopes of purchasing human cargo without some form of common language to use to communicate with? Now, a nickname surname identifies an individual based upon commonly known attributes or adjectives that would best describe that person in some way. It could be based upon personal characteristics, shape, size, color of hair, skin complexion, or even for some derogatory motives an individual may have for another individual or group of people for that matter. Contrary to popular belief, nicknames have been around for many generations throughout thousands of different cultures across the world. So we can immediately rule out this type of surname with having some origins in Europe easily. There are various types of nicknames used throughout history. Like, for example, nearly all religious institutions calls for its members to bear a formal nickname traditionally. Like, a traditional Christian nickname can be identified often by two given nicknames, or rather four names, instead of one, at the time of baptism, like Mary Ann or Anne Mary, for example. The actor Morgan Freeman also bears a religious nickname surname as well, due to the many so-called black people who refused to change their surnames before and even after the Emancipation Proclamation was established. When you are conducting genealogy research on your families, meaning a paper trail, you will soon discover that many of our ancestors did in fact use their own created surname that was royally different from the surname that was allegedly given to them by their employers at the time of signing their indentures, or rather labor contracts, now known as applications of employment. Our ancestors manifested independence and freedom by rejecting foreign surnames to be a part of their family's lineage, especially at the time of the Emancipation Proclamation. Keep in mind that many of the surnames of our ancestors had to be written into a record. This changes everything that you were ever told of when it comes to so-called American descendants of slavery. This is why it is very essential to check the records of your family's genealogy before you go out and state to the public that your family bears a European surname, when you have absolutely no idea that you could be inadvertently disrespecting your very own people that fought for your freedom and to build this country. I'm just here to make you think.